So we are in the series called what? Do something. That's right. And in this series we've been talking about what? Injustice. And as you know, I know a thing or two about justice. It is my middle name after all. It's a weird question. What emoji do you guys use the most? Just show me what emoji you use the most. I see this going on. I see like tears. If you don't know for sure, there's a scientific way you can figure out. You guys know? If you Google, no, I'm just kidding. Just go to your messages, type your emoji button, and then frequently used. Not the memojis, but the ones after that. Does anybody use the memojis? No, I don't either. What's my most? Okay, so my most used emoji is not the devil. Thank you very much. Yeah, I see you. My most used emoji is the thumbs up. I give the thumbs up to a lot of people. I'm actually probably one of those that would annoy most of you texting because I use emojis in a lot of my texts, and maybe at least 50% of my texts. And I know that's not cool, but whatever. So I use the thumbs up one the most. The second one I use the most is the laughing, crying one. That's like, ah, and then tears falling because I'm so funny. And I also have the slap one is like up there. It's my third. And my fourth is just the nice smile with the mouth closed and like the upside down U eyes. That one I use a lot. But I will tell you, one of them that's up there pretty high, it's actually my 7th highest one. And I know it because on my MacBook, I have that little screen that's at the front of my keyboard, and I can scroll and I can literally count. My 7th one is one that I'm sure many of you use a lot, but it's the shrug one. Anybody else use that one? Yeah, I use that one a lot. Not because I'm humble and I just admit that I don't know a lot, because that's not the case. The reason I use it a lot is because a lot of times it's like, why is the world this way? Like, why are people dumb when they drive? Like, right? Well, why? Probably you guys, it's like, why is math? And you just, I don't know. How many of you actually like math? I'm sorry. I rip on math a lot. How many of you are like, when it comes to math, you're like, yes, yep. So I actually used to be good at math. But I hated it, and only certain kinds of math. I have an algebra mind, so I'm good at algebra type stuff. Was 10 years ago. I don't know if I am anymore. I haven't looked at an equation in a long time. But it's one of those things that, like, you know, in life there's lots of things that you have questions about, and there's a lot of things, like especially in this series we've been talking about injustice, and what do we as Christians do about injustice? How do we think about injustice? And a lot of the time, our answers kind of like not I don't care, but just I don't know, right? Like there's these huge problems in the world, like poverty. There's world hunger. But I don't know. There's 8 billion people on the planet. How do you feed everybody when most of the world's resources are consumed in our land? Like how do you fix all the problems that we see in the world? And then we've talked about so many of these throughout the series, but last week we talked specifically on the fact that God calls us to do something when it comes to injustice. You know, the things that you look at and you think, why doesn't somebody do something about that? God has actually called us to be the someones to do the some things about injustice in the world. And it's not for a lack of effort on God's part, because if you were here last week, we talked about, you know, how Jesus ultimately did everything for us. And so therefore, he's passed on the baton to us, and he also promises to be with you. And I encourage you to go back and watch last week's message if you missed it, because we talk about probably one of the biggest questions that people face, not just Christians but non-Christians alike. What do we do about pain, evil, suffering, if God is all powerful and all good? And we talked about that last week, and we talked about the idea that, you know what, Jesus is not above suffering because he himself came and he was suffering for us. And so actually there's all kinds of things that we can do. We can do something when it comes to injustice, but a lot of the times, practically speaking, we don't know what that looks like. We don't always have the answers to the world's problems. We know we should do something, or maybe we feel compelled to do something. How many of you've seen like a video on social media that makes your blood just boil and for all the righteous reasons because that wasn't just. And you're like, I want to do something. What do I do to fix that issue? And a lot of times we're just stuck with this, I don't know what I do. And just to make sure we're all on the same page, we talked about this back in week 1 of this series, but just as a recap, when we're talking about injustice, we should probably define justice. So when you hear people talk about justice, it simply means something that is right, fair, or equal. That makes sense? Right, fair, equal, and conversely, that's a mathematical term. Injustice would be not fair or not right or not equal, unequal. And a lot of times when it comes to injustice, this is what we're talking about, and we're trying to figure out, well, how do we pull things more to the left side of that screen? How do we make things right? How do we make things fair? How do we make things equal? There's some things in this world we can make a real change about. There's some things that we can't. For example, there's things and causes that we can get on board with to initiate change and make things right. And then there's things that we can't, like you can't change the person next to you all the time. Sometimes you can develop a relationship and have a conversation and change thoughts. But ultimately, the changing work that has to be done in someone has to come straight from the Holy Spirit. Sometimes we just have to do our part and plant the seed and allow the Spirit to grow that seed. And so, what does that look like? I want to remind you guys, again, that if you were here last week when we talked about the harvest. The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. We went through that passage where Jesus talked about there's so much to be done in the world. The harvest is plenty, but the workers are few. And you are one of the few if you decide to follow Jesus. If you decide to give your life to Him, then you are one of the few who have chosen to work that harvest. You are somebody who could do something. I know a lot of times we think like, I even think, I'm in my 20s, and I think I'm too young to make a difference in the world, right? I'm not wise and elderly. I haven't experienced life yet. I'm only me, I can't do much in the world. And I know that, especially when I was in high school, and we did the series with our middle schoolers, like a month ago, and a lot of them feel like I'm just a middle schooler. I'm just in intermediate school. There's nothing really that I can do. And so, but I want to remind you that you are somebody. You are somebody that can make a difference and can do stuff. So today, in order to kind of kick this off and to kind of put a cap on the end of this series, I want to talk from the book of James. If you know anything about James, there was a couple of James that we hear about in the Bible. There's James the apostle, like the disciple of Jesus, like the brother of John, the other disciple of Jesus who wrote the Gospel of John, and that was James. But there's also James, the half brother of Jesus. And so this James who wrote the letter that we find at the end of our New Testament, James is the half brother of Jesus. He's not the disciple who followed Jesus while Jesus was alive and doing his ministry. In fact, James didn't believe in Jesus as God until after the resurrection. He goes, oh, okay, so he's the real deal. And then James started becoming one of the big changers in the church in the early first century and began to spread the gospel and began to teach people and began to make a difference and push forward what it means to not only follow God, but also to bring justice to the world. How many of you guys, if I were to poll all of you in this room, actually I don't even need to ask you, this can be a rhetorical question. I know if I polled all of you in the room, you would all say, I want to do something that is meaningful with my life. I want to do something that makes a difference in the world, that changes the world and changes the people in the world, that changes life for the people that live in this world that will live after me. I want to leave a legacy that is meaningful and impactful for the next generation, for the generations to come. Nobody wakes up and goes, you know what? I think I want to be a slum bag that just does nothing with my life, right? We all want to make a difference. We all want to be able to do something, and we all want to be able to help the world become more just. And James gives us some very specific ways that we can do that. So let's dive into James chapter 2, starting in verse 15. It says, suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? You guys know what he's talking about, right? Your parents ever tell you actions speak louder than words? Like most of the time, it's when you're in trouble and you're trying to say sorry, but it's something that you've been in trouble for many times, and they say something along the lines of, well, actions speak louder than words, right? Oh, you're sorry? Why don't you prove it, right? And it's one of those things that you're mad because you know you're caught, and you're like, I don't really have a comeback for that. Unless I can find dirt on you, and then you talk back to your parents, and then it ends even worse than it was when you started. Yeah, I've never done that before, but it doesn't come from personal experience. But oftentimes when we are at fault, what do? It's the sin as old as Adam. You blame somebody else. Remember, he goes, God, that woman you put here, she took the fruit you said not to eat and gave it to me, and I ate, right? Blame. It's the oldest sin in the book, other than, I guess, Eve taking, disobeying. But you get what I'm saying. It's as old as the first humans. Is blame. The problem with blame is nothing gets done. As a staff at the church, we're actually going through a book called Extreme Ownership. It's by a couple of military guys that came back and had a lot of experience in leadership. And Jocko Willink, I don't know, you've probably heard of him, yeah. So he's pretty famous, but we're going through this book called Extreme Ownership, and the idea is, if you're going to make a difference in your workplace, in your school, on your team, then you have to apply the rules of extreme ownership. You have to own everything. If something goes wrong, you have to own your part in it, or nothing will change. People will continue to make excuses, and people will see the excuses you make and will either follow in suit and make the same excuses for their own mistakes, or they will see your example of taking ownership and they might learn something. See, to be human is to be flawed. We're all going to make mistakes. But the truly great humans know how to own them and not pass the buck of blame onto somebody else. And James is talking about, there's injustice in the world. In fact, you guys have probably, if you've been anywhere in Indy, then you've seen this. If you've been, you don't even have to leave Franklin. You see homeless people. You see people without food. You see people in need. Maybe they're not homeless people on the street, but maybe they're people you go to school with, and they're in your class, and they don't come from a good situation. That they're maybe without food. That when the lockdowns were happening and school wasn't happening in person, that maybe they didn't have a meal. And that there's nothing good about that. But what's worse is sometimes we contribute to the problems by doing nothing, by giving lip service, by saying, I hope you do well, or the Christian version is, I'll pray for you, right? Like sometimes that's good and we mean it, and that's good, we should pray for people. But sometimes when that's all we do, James is saying, that's not enough. If you give lip service to something, but you don't actually do anything about it, then what good is it? We often settle for just saying or posting something and doing nothing. This is actually, this strikes a little closer to home than when you just think about it on the surface. We live in a copy-paste culture. You guys know what I mean by that? A copy-paste culture is you see something that somebody shared on social media, copy, paste, and share it to your story, or share it on your profile, or change it in your bio, and it's a copy-paste. And a lot of times those things sound really good. It's like, I can latch onto that idea, and you copy it, you paste it. But oftentimes we don't know where those come from, or if there's any truth to those things, they just sound good. And so we're trained to kind of copy, paste, and repeat messages without actually fully thinking through them. And a lot of it has to do with the scrolling mentality that is the current life in our culture. We intake so much information, we stop processing it all. In fact, there's studies that some say like you retain like maybe 4% of what you read in a day, because we just intake so much information that we can only retain so much of it. And so oftentimes we're copy, paste, reshare, and we haven't actually done the work. And oftentimes in order to initiate change, you got to do more than raise awareness. You got to do something. But the raising awareness part is the easiest. It's the shortest, the branch on the tree, the closest reach, the shortest rung on the ladder. It's the easiest thing to grab hold of and just do. And often we find ourselves guilty of what James says is if you say things and do nothing about the actual needs, then what good is it? We give lip service and don't actually contribute to the solution. And the thing about injustice is Jesus always participated in injustice everywhere he went. He was constantly healing people. He was constantly giving of himself and of his time, even when he was tired at the end of the day. He gave of himself to talk to the people that nobody else would talk with, to the outcasts, to the people that nobody thought was worth anything. And he cared about doing something about injustice. He knew that people were a part of a world where, everybody placed the blame. If you were disabled, then it was because of a sin you did or your parents did. And there was the blame thing. And Jesus said, actually, no, I see you as a person beyond just either your disability or your sin, because he met with both people, the disabled and the sinful. And he gave them value, and he brought them justice of a different kind, the kind that people didn't expect. And James says in the very next verse, he says, in the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. Do you guys know what I mean by the term virtue signaling? Is that something you guys are familiar with? Like, I see like a couple heads, raise your hand if you've heard that term virtue signaling and you know what it means. Okay, so virtue signaling is basically, I talked about this copy-paste culture. It's where you hear something that sounds good and you paste it, or you do the thing. You tell everybody else why they're wrong about something by talking about what is actually right about a wrong situation. Or you take something that everybody else is latching onto, a narrative, and you repost it and reshare it in an effort to shame those who don't think that same way. That is virtue signaling. That's signaling your virtue to everybody else. Look how good I am for agreeing with this thing. Look how good I am for talking about this injustice. Virtue signaling is like words without action. It actually doesn't solve anything, and most of the time that's what most of us try to do. You guys also know what SJWs are? Social justice warriors. Is that a term you're familiar with? Or is that something that you guys don't really talk about much at your age? Social justice warriors are people who look at social issues like equal pay for men and women, racial issues, all kinds of stuff that are a lot of times political conversations, but have to do with the social life of people. There's words like equity that are thrown around a lot, equity and equality, which actually don't mean the same thing. But all of these come with baggage, all these come with complex issues in them. And it's nothing that can be solved by a 1 or 2 sentence thing that can be reposted and shared. And that's called virtue signaling. And that's what social justice warriors are all about. They're people who are trying to enact social justice and change to the social dynamic of our culture and of the world without actually knowing everything about an issue or doing anything about the issue, except virtue signal to everybody else who's following them. And so I want to talk about this, harp on this a little bit, not because I'm trying to sway you of any particular issue, because that's not what we're here for, but what I'm trying to teach you to do is to think deeper than the one-liners you see on social media. Think deeper than the things that you just see and that is copied and pasted and reshared. Because all these issues are complex. All of these issues have lots of dynamics to them, and there is no simple answer that just virtue signaling your social justice warrior status is going to solve. And so I want to say that because this is actually backed up to what James has to say. And when we think of all these great big issues, a lot of us go back to feeling like, well, what can I do? What can I do about that issue? And it feels very abstract. It feels very unattainable to actually be able to enact change when it comes to these big social issues. When it comes to any issue that you see injustice, it can feel like, well, what can I do when we're talking about these kinds of things? And when we frame our discussions just around those little talking points without actually figuring out what we can do, then we miss the point. And what James says is actually we have to do something. If you have a faith that is alive and active, then it will go beyond your words or your posting to take it to the 21st century. It'll go beyond words and it'll be accompanied by action. And in the same way, our faith, if it is not accompanied by action, it's dead. Words without deeds are useless. James talks a lot about feeding orphans and widows. He talks about taking care of those who don't have clothes, those who are in need of physical things. He's talked in a lot of people, specifically like the orphans and widows. The people he talks about are people who are unable to help themselves. They are people that, whether it's their situation, or because of what they were born into, or because of what has happened to them, or maybe even because of choices they made and they found themselves in a hole so deep they can't dig themselves out. And no amount of governmental programs is going to solve it, because it's far easier to legislate something than it is to actually fix a problem. And James is saying, don't wait on, and we talked about this last week, all throughout history, the church has been a part of change. Hospitals, scientific discoveries, all kinds of things that have made the world better. Orphanages, talking about what James talks about. The church has been on the front lines of these things. And James is saying, you want to enact real change, it starts with you. It starts with what you can do with your life, with your influence to enact change. It's about the seeds that you yourself can plant with those resources that you have. And yeah, that includes conversations. Yeah, that includes lip service. But it must be accompanied by action to actually make a difference. This is tough to grab onto in our culture. But when James talks about helping those who can't help themselves, you and I can both think of people who fit that description a lot easier than we can think about these big programs that need to happen or what needs to change in our society. We can think of people who often can't help themselves. And sometimes it's as little as just inserting yourself into their life in a strategic way. You see something, we talk about this all the time. You see somebody at the table sitting by themselves. You may not even have the extra $5 in your pocket to make a difference for them as far as like physical needs at that moment, but you can go and sit next to them and make a friend out of that situation. You can start a relationship with somebody. You can care for people. And the number one thing that people are lacking in, you've heard that mental health is a crisis right now. Many of you have dealt with mental health issues. I've dealt with, do I have to check my own mental health? This is an everybody thing, but it's talked about a lot. Mental health is a real concern, especially given the last year. That's a bigger need than any of the physical needs right now. And those physical needs are often stemming from the mental health. But if you can, people are feeling isolated and lonely. If you can make a friend and build a relationship with somebody, that can enact change. And that's something that you have the ability to do. And it doesn't have to take a whole lot of effort. It takes more effort as time goes on and as you build relationships. But there are steps that you can take to make a difference in somebody's life. And when you get to know somebody, you can know better how to help them. Because you'll learn what their struggles are. And you'll learn, oh, well, actually, if you're struggling in this, I'm actually really good at math. I can help you with this. Get your grade up to a point where you can apply for some scholarship. Like, you can give people help by the gifts that you've been given by God. By the seeds that you've been planting in your own life, you can share some of that crop and help other people. And so James talks about you got to look out for those who can't help themselves. And if you've ever done this, you know that it's exhausting. How many of you you've helped somebody that whether you wanted to originally or not, it was way more work than you thought it was going to be when you started. And you've helped that person, but at the end of it, you were happy, you were glad you did it, you felt better about it, but it was exhausting. This takes work. It takes giving of ourselves. And as selfish people, that's hard. But it's when we give of ourselves that we start making a difference in the world. It may feel like it's not working. If you've done this before, you may feel like it's not working. You may have tried to help somebody only to be pushed away. You may have tried to do the right thing only to get made fun of for it, pushed back on it, neglected for it. You may have tried to do things before and it just didn't feel like it was working. But it's just like if you were to plant a physical seed. When Jesus is talking about the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few, sometimes those workers need to plant more seeds. Sometimes when you plant a seed, how many of you in elementary school, you did the little plant thing that you put up to the window and you waited for it to grow? Like for weeks, it seemed like nothing was happening, right? Like nothing was sprouting. You would water it, you put it next to the sun, it seemed like nothing was happening. But actually, beneath the surface of the soil, a lot was happening, right? The seed was sprouting, it was taking root, and it was building itself up before you even had seen it peek out of the soil. And a lot of times, the seeds that we plant, we don't always get to see it sprout. But it doesn't mean we're not making a difference. So when it's exhausting, when it feels like maybe we're not doing anything, the message I want for you guys to remember is to never stop doing something. When it comes to injustice, never stop doing something. One of the companions of Paul, they crossed paths a few times, James and Paul. Paul talked to the church in Galatia, and he talks to them about this idea of fatigue, and he says this. He says, Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people. In other words, you will have opportunity at some point. Some of us, we have opportunities every day that we pass up because we don't see them. He doesn't say if you get opportunity, he says as you have opportunity. Do good to all people. Don't get weary of doing good. You may not always see the results right away, but as long as you are changing, then you are making a change that will impact people beyond the moment. So practically speaking, what does that mean? I've got 4 things that you can do when it comes to making a difference and doing something about the injustice we see in the world. 1 is use your voice. There is an aspect of this where you do have to speak up. When you see something happening that's not right, say something about it. Often, many people feel the same way as you. They just lack the courage to speak up and say something about it. But you can ignite the flame of courage in other people around you by also standing up and being the first to speak up when you see something that is unjust. So use your voice as opportunity arises. Keep saying something until something changes. Number 2, use your influence. I know that word is wrapped around a lot of different things, and we think of social media influence, we think of influencers, we think of, I've got to be popular to have influence. You have influence with the people that you share life with. Whether it's great or small, you have influence with the people that you have relationships with. You have influence, and you have the ability to use your influence with the people in your life that can make changes. If you're intentional with those people and intentional with those relationships, you gain influence with those people in order to enact bigger change and to change thought, change perspective, give guidance, and to help one another out. But also, some of you are gifted with the ability of influence to be able to influence people you don't have a relationship with. Some of you, you've got bigger social media followings than half of the adults I know. You've got influence. When you say something, people listen. So use your influence to point people back towards God. Thirdly, use your talent. Now, not all of us have the same talents. Not all of us have as many talents. But we all have something. We all have gifts that God's given us, things that we're good at, ways that we think about things, whether it's our perspective on things, our ability to have discernment, or it's actual abilities like with sports or clubs or something else. You have the ability to use your talent to make a difference and to change the world. So be looking for ways that you can use your talent, even if your talent is just a means to a platform. You look at celebrities nowadays, you see people who, just take basketball for instance. There are lots of people in the NBA with a tremendous amount of influence because of their basketball skills. You can use the talents that God has given to you, and you can use that as a means to an end of your influence to influence people for the kingdom of God. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart and give the glory to God. Last thing is use your life. I'm not saying that you have to volunteer for everything. I'm not saying you have to give up all of your time, but I am saying you should give up some of your time. You should give of your life. Your life is not your own. It was bought at a price. So honor God with your life. Honor God by giving of your life to the people around you, which sounds so backwards in today's life because the messages that are thrown at us all day is do what you need to do to be happy. Do what feels right. But God calls us to give of ourselves, and giving of ourselves doesn't always feel right, doesn't always make us happy, but it gives us ultimate satisfaction in the end. So use your voice, your influence, your talent in your life in such a way that it can enact life change. And when you feel weary, like it's not doing anything, never give up and never stop. Never stop doing something about injustice. All right, let me pray, and then we'll be dismissed into our small groups.